Let us shift our attention for the last two topics of this module. Let us take up another significant front of changes that are challenging contemporary societies, namely the challenge of climate change and that of environmental degradation. Since 2005, the weight of scientific opinion has clearly gathered around the idea that something of consequence is happening to the world's climate and that human activity is largely responsible. Of the few remaining detractors, it is rare now to hear them argue that climate change isn't occurring, but what they do dispute is the degree of human involvement. Now, this is really important when it comes to science teaching. You will recall that the Conservatives complained that science students spent as much time studying the social and other consequences of science than they did how to do science itself. Now, doing science well is very important. After all, this is where most of our information about climate change and environmental degradation has come from. So, for example, in 1962, Rachel Carsons, a marine biologist, published her Silent Spring, in which she documented the toxic effects on wildlife and on humans stemming from DDT use, a pesticide that was widely used in agriculture in that time. And Carsons' work was very influential in gathering popular opinion against DDT use. Now, underlying the view that science students should study science and leave cultural and social matters aside is the idea that society and nature are effectively distinct worlds. There is a division between the two of them. The question I want to ask in this topic and the next one is, how sustainable is this idea of a division between society and nature? It is certainly there in the old views of science that you may recognise, those views of the scientist leaving the social world either literally and venturing out into the field, or figuratively gazing out at the natural world using a variety of scientific instruments, or in the scientist creating a little piece of nature within society, yet immunised from, closed off from any social influences, namely the laboratory. Now, this division is a very old one. Indeed, it is built in to the way that we understand the term nature itself. I would wager that most of you, if called upon to define what nature is, you would use a variant of the argument, well, it's untouched by human hands. Society, on the other hand, is seen as artificial. It's made by human beings. Indeed, this distinction was very important to early modern understandings of humanness itself. Human beings lived in environments that they made for themselves. Cities. Nature existed out in the wilderness. And those human beings who lived in the wilderness, they were referred to as savage. Becoming human for these early modern people involved somehow taking control of one's animal self. Those who couldn't do this, those who couldn't control their emotions or took undue delight in their bodily processes, they were considered beasts or brutes, not quite human. Now, a number of sociologists, anthropologists, and indeed natural scientists are challenging this idea of a division. Indeed, many argue that it was always just a myth. We only need to think of the city, which has never ever just been a place in which human beings dwelled alongside those plants and those animals that they allowed to live alongside them in there. Cities have always been great breeding grounds for microbial organisms, spreading diseases, cockroaches, rats, and weeds. This distinction between the natural and the social gets even harder to sustain once we realise that human action in the world and on the world and their reactions to it are just part of a wider process of nature acting and reacting. This is why a number of significant thinkers are now proposing that instead of thinking in terms of a division between the social and the natural, what we ought to be doing is thinking in terms of collections of humans and non-humans, be these animate or inanimate, sharing a common world.